The air, or rather, the lack of it, pressed against me. A suffocating vacuum where sound should be. I adjusted the hydro recorder, the cold metal biting into my numb fingers. Petrol, that's the only word for it. Iridescent petrol bleeding through the water, staining the corroded metal of the observatory's dome, a sickly shimmering green. It clung to everything, a film of decay illuminated by an unnatural light. I documented it all, the precise angle of the refracted beams, the patterns of algae clinging to the viewport. Another performance for an audience that doesn't exist. The cat watched. A dirty orange tabby, ribs showing beneath matted fur, perched atop the skeletal remains of a massive telescope. Its ears were ragged, torn as if by some unseen force. It blinked slowly, a reptilian indifference radiating from its yellow eyes. It reminded me of her, not in appearance, of course, but in that detached observation, that silent judgment, another cruel joke from the universe. I ran a diagnostic on the recorder. Baseline established. The temporal anomaly registered as a negligible fluctuation, though I suspect that's a lie. Everything here feels displaced, like a memory struggling to surface, distorted and incomplete. The silence is the worst of it. A tangible weight, a physical manifestation of absence. It amplifies the echoes of my own thoughts, turning them into accusations. The iron gates. They groaned, a protracted, agonizing creak as they swung shut behind me. Not a slam, not a clang, but a slow, deliberate sealing. Each hinge protested with a drawn-out whine, a metallic lament that resonated in the oppressive quiet. It's almost comical, really. A stage prop for my personal tragedy. She loved theatrical entrances. I began the initial sweep of the main chamber. The wallpaper peeled in long curling strips, revealing layers of faded floral patterns beneath. Each movement sent a shower of dust motes swirling in the petrol light, miniature galaxies suspended in the stagnant air. I ran a gloved hand along the wall, the texture rough and brittle beneath my fingertips. The smell was pervasive, sooty, a cloying sweetness mingled with the sharp tang of rust and decay. A scent that clung to the back of my throat, a phantom taste of regret. The silence hummed. It wasn't truly silent, of course. There was the subtle hiss of the water against the hull, a constant, almost imperceptible pressure, and the cat, it hadn't moved, hadn't uttered a sound. Just watched. I checked the camera's reflection. Nothing. Just the distorted image of the chamber, the petrol light fracturing across the lens. I felt it then, that familiar prickling at the back of my neck. The sensation of being watched, dismissed it, of course. Paranoia is a constant companion to insomnia. Another sweep. I opened a drawer in a corroded metal desk. It stuck, protesting with a grating rasp. Inside, nothing but dust and the skeletal remains of a dried-up insect. I closed it with a soft click. The echo seemed to linger, distorted and elongated, as if the chamber itself were mocking me. I rechecked the camera. Another sweep, another nothing. Just the oppressive green light, the peeling wallpaper, the silent cat. I felt the loneliness again, a physical ache in my chest. It's always there, isn't it? A constant reminder of what I've lost. She would have laughed. Found the humor in my self-imposed exile. I looked at the camera again. This time, a flicker. A fleeting distortion in the reflection. Something there behind me. I twisted, heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Just the empty chamber, the petrol light, the silent cat. I peered back at the camera, gone. A trick of the light, I told myself. A phantom image born of fatigue and despair. But the camera still recorded. The glass. It dominated everything. Massive. Curved domes, once pristine, now clouded with algae and etched with the relentless assault of the water. I circled them, hydro recorder held steady, documenting the decay, each imperfection, each crack, a testament to time's indifference. Petrol sheen clinging to the curves, refracting the unnatural light into a kaleidoscope of sickly greens and blues. Another performance for an audience that doesn't exist. The cat remained, a silent sentinel perched atop a crumbling control panel. Its yellow eyes, twin pools of stagnant light, tracked my every movement. It felt deliberate. Not the casual observation of a stray, but a calculated assessment, a cruel parody of loyalty. I moved towards a workbench, its surface coated in a thick layer of grime. A scattering of objects lay upon it, tools, gauges, and something else. Buttons, dozens of them, arranged haphazardly. Antique, I realized, the metal dulled with age, the once vibrant colors faded. Each depicted a figure, a symbol, gods perhaps, forgotten gods. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the detail unsettling. A tiny leering face carved into the surface of one, another a serpentine form coiled around a crumbling ziggurat. The petrol light caught them, illuminating their silent, malevolent expressions. I felt a compulsion, a sudden urge to arrange them, a ridiculous impulse I knew born of boredom and the oppressive silence. I reached out, my gloved fingers brushing against the cold metal. The cat's ears twitched, a subtle movement barely perceptible in the dim light. The water within the domes seemed to ripple, a subtle distortion that I initially dismissed as a trick of the light. But it persisted, the reflections warping and twisting, creating grotesque caricatures of the observatory's interior. The hum of the underwater currents intensified, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the metal floor. Thrum. Thrum. It pressed against my eardrums, a phantom heartbeat. I tried to rationalize it. The pressure, the isolation, the constant exposure to the petrol fumes. It was all playing tricks on my mind. She would have found it amusing. My descent into madness meticulously documented for posterity. I began to arrange the buttons, an instinctive pattern forming in my mind. A circle, of course, a ritualistic arrangement for an audience that doesn't exist. The cat watched, its eyes unwavering. The hum grew louder, a palpable pressure in my chest. Thrum, thrum. Another distortion in the water, this time more pronounced. The reflections elongated, stretched, as if the glass itself were breathing. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, that familiar sensation of being watched. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing, just the empty chamber, the petrol light, the silent cat. I peered back at the camera, a desperate need to confirm my sanity. The reflections shimmered, distorted, but there was nothing else. Just the oppressive green light, the peeling wallpaper, the silent cat. The loneliness returned, a crushing weight on my chest. It's always there, isn't it? A constant reminder of what I've lost. I continued arranging the buttons, the circle nearing completion. The hum escalated, morphing into a low guttural drone. Thrum, thrum. Drone, drone. The water in the domes began to vibrate, the reflections blurring into an indistinguishable mess. Then I saw them. A swarm. A swirling vortex of flies coalescing in the air directly in front of me. They didn't buzz, didn't move with the chaotic energy of a swarm. They hung suspended, a black cloud against the petrol light, centered on the spot where I believed I had seen the figure. A silent, swirling darkness. The flies, they hung a black void. I blinked. They remained static, a thin, persistent hiss layered over the absolute silence. Hiss, hiss. It wasn't external. It resonated within my skull, a phantom signal. She would have laughed. Frederick, you're imagining things. Always the detached observer cataloging my unraveling. The buttons, they pulsed, a faint internal luminescence, like embers struggling to ignite. Ridiculous. The petrol light reflecting off the metal, creating the illusion. I tightened my grip on the hydro recorder, the cold metal a small comfort against the rising tide of something, not fear, disdain. A profound, weary disdain for the absurdity of it all. The cat shifted on the control panel, a silent ripple of muscle beneath its dirty orange fur. A rasp of fur against metal, fur a scritch. It didn't acknowledge the flies, didn't acknowledge anything beyond its calculated assessment of me. It's a performance, isn't it? A silent, mocking audience. I attempted to record a note to document the flies, the pulsing buttons, the insidious static. My fingers fumbled with the controls, the hydro recorder remained stubbornly silent. Of course, another failure. Another reminder of the limitations imposed upon me. The water in the domes, it seemed closer. The glass, once a barrier, felt like a membrane pressing against my skin. A single drop of water detached itself from the ceiling, falling with agonizing slowness. Drip. The sound amplified. Resonating within the chamber, a hammer blow against the silence. It impacted the metal floor with a tiny metallic clang. Clink. I tried to focus on the scientific method. Observe. Record. Analyze. Rationalize. The flies were an anomaly. The pulsing buttons were an optical illusion. The static was a symptom of equipment malfunction. All perfectly explainable, all perfectly meaningless. The static intensified, a rising tide of noise threatening to drown out the memory of true silence. It warped the reflections in the glass, distorting the observatory's interior into a grotesque parody of its former grandeur. The shadows deepened, clinging to the corners of the chamber like predatory things. The cat's eyes narrowed, twin slits of stagnant light. It tilted its head, a gesture of mocking curiosity. It knew. It knew I was losing my grip. It knew the rationalizations were crumbling. I glanced at the buttons again. The circle was almost complete. A compulsion stronger than reason urged me to place the final piece. A tiny leering face on one of the buttons seemed to smile, a silent, malevolent encouragement. The static coalesced. It wasn't just a hiss anymore. It was words fragmented, distorted, barely audible. I strained to decipher them, my mind grasping at the edges of meaning. Frederick. The sound was wrong. It was familiar yet warped, twisted into something alien. It echoed within my skull, a phantom whisper that resonated with a chilling familiarity. It was her voice, but not her, a mockery of her. Remember. The water in the domes began to vibrate violently. The reflections shattered, splintering into 1,000 distorted images. The flies swirled faster, a black vortex consuming the light. Us. The static resolved into a single coherent phrase delivered in a voice that was both intimately familiar and utterly horrifying. It was a cruel joke, a twisted echo of a past that could never be reclaimed. A final devastating blow to my already shattered sanity. You forgot me, Frederick. The phrases sharpened. Not distinct words, not yet, but fragments. Remember the lilies? A sickly sweetness clung to the air, a phantom fragrance overlaid on the metallic tang of decay. Lilies, she'd loved lilies. A deliberate cruelty, a mocking echo of a shared memory. The disdain returned, a bitter taste on my tongue. Sentimentality was a weakness, a vulnerability. And I, Frederick Kensington, would not be vulnerable. The hydro recorder remained inert. Another failure. I slammed my fist against the casing, a dull thud swallowed by the oppressive silence. The cat watched, its orange fur a smear of color against the iridescent petrol sheen of the control panel. Error scritch. The sound seemed to amplify within the chamber, a tiny grating rebellion against the stillness. It wasn't mocking me precisely. It was observing, cataloging as she would have. The central chamber, the machinery, it beckoned. A vast circular space, dominated by interlocking gears, pistons, and conduits, all coated in a thick layer of rust. The iridescent petrol sheen clung to everything, distorting the angles, making the space feel both immense and claustrophobic. The flies swirled, a black vortex near the center of the room, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm. They were a focal point, a malignant eye staring back at me. The metal groaned, a low, guttural sound like a leviathan shifting in its sleep. It wasn't the sound of decay. It was transformation. The gears seemed to rotate subtly, almost imperceptibly. The pistons pulsed with a faint internal rhythm. The conduits writhed like metallic veins. The architecture itself was sea-changing. I ran a hand along the surface of a massive gear, the metal cold and slick beneath my fingers. The rust crumbled, revealing a layer of polished bronze beneath. Then, another layer, and another, each layer a different metal, a different age. It was as if the observatory was peeling back the layers of its own history, revealing a hidden, unsettling truth. The cat emitted a low growl, a rumbling vibration in its chest. It wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the machinery then, a sound I hadn't heard before. A faint, melodic chime, emanating from the depths of the chamber. It was fleeting, ephemeral, like a dream dissolving upon waking. The audio fragments returned, sharper this time. The garden. The roses. Roses. Another memory. Another barb. I clenched my fists, fighting back the rising tide of... What? Not grief. Not sadness. Something colder, more clinical disappointment. I moved deeper into the chamber, drawn by the melodic chime. The flies followed, swirling around me like a living shroud. The air grew thick, heavy, almost viscous. The iridescent petrol sheen intensified, reflecting my distorted image back at me. I looked like a ghost, a specter haunting my own tomb. Then I saw it. A section of the wall previously obscured by the machinery revealed itself. It wasn't metal, it was stone. Ancient weathered stone covered in intricate carvings, and upon the stone an inscription. The language was unfamiliar, yet as I gazed upon the symbols, a strange understanding bloomed within my mind. It wasn't a translation. It was a resonance, a feeling, a knowing. The words formed in my mind, not as sounds, but as impressions, as emotions, as memories that weren't my own. The cat stopped its growling. It sat perfectly still, its eyes fixed on the inscription. A single, drawn-out exhale, the audio fragments coalesced, forming a single chilling phrase. A phrase that resonated with the inscription, with the machinery, with the very essence of the observatory. The architect awaits. The stone began to glow. The arrangement felt necessary. Not a whim, not a compulsion, but a dictated order. The buttons, each one a cold obsidian weight in my palm, I laid them out on the workbench, their surfaces reflecting the iridescent petrol sheen of the observatory's light. A god's face here, a serpent coiled there, a forgotten symbol I couldn't name but felt echoing in the marrow of my bones. Click, 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 click. The sound was amplified in the silence, a brittle counterpoint to the heavy thrumming in my temples. The flies, they were back. A swirling black vortex near the workbench, their wings a frantic blur. They didn't land, they circled, observing, judging. A mockery of attention, she'd collected butterflies, pinned them to velvet boards. A morbid hobby, she'd called it. A way to preserve beauty. I preferred buttons. They were less fragile, less sentimental. Click. Another button placed, another god aligned. The light intensified. The petrol sheen bled into the shadows, swallowing the edges of the workbench, the machinery behind me. It wasn't a natural light. It was a distortion, a refraction of something else. It pressed against my eyelids, a physical weight. I blinked, fighting the rising tide of nausea. The inscription, the words, they danced behind my eyes, fragments of a language I shouldn't understand. The architect awaits. The phrase clung to the inside of my skull, a persistent echo. The cat watched, its orange fur a burning ember in the encroaching darkness. Its eyes, those eyes, they weren't the eyes of a cat. They were knowing, calculating. They reflected the light, not as a simple reflection, but as a focused beam. A gaze that pierced through me, dissecting my thoughts, my memories. A low rumble in its chest, a vibration that resonated within my own bones. It wasn't a threat, it was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. I felt it then, a detachment, a loosening of the tether that bound me to my own will. My hand moved, not of its own volition, but guided by an unseen force. I reached for another button. A grotesque visage of a horned deity, its eyes hollow pits of despair. Click. The sound resonated through the chamber, a tiny fracture in the oppressive silence. She would have laughed at this, at me, at the absurdity of it all. A man arranging buttons, playing God. A pathetic attempt to impose order on chaos sentimentality, a weakness. And yet, there was a perverse satisfaction in the arrangement. A sense of completion, a fleeting glimpse of understanding. The flies swirled faster, their movements becoming erratic, almost frantic. They buzzed against my face, their tiny legs tickling my skin. I swatted them away, a meaningless gesture. They were beyond my control, beyond anyone's control. The light pulsed, a rhythmic beat that synchronized with the thrumming in my temples. Click, click, click. Another button. Another god. Another layer of the puzzle revealed. The cat's eyes glowed brighter, an unnatural luminescence that seemed to emanate from within. It shifted its weight, its tail twitching rhythmically. Error. A deeper rumble this time. A vibration that shook the workbench. I felt a tremor in my hand. A subtle vibration that mirrored the cat's movement. I was connected, bound to this ritual, a pawn in a game I didn't understand. The detachment deepened. The sense of control evaporated. I was an observer, a witness to my own actions. My hand reached for the final button. A single, tarnished disc depicting a figure shrouded in shadow. The architect. Foklik. The sound was different this time. Not brittle, not sharp. Deep. It echoed through the chamber, reverberating in the very foundations of the observatory. Then, it began slowly, almost imperceptibly. The button levitated. Rising from the workbench, suspended in the iridescent light. It hung there, shimmering, pulsating with an inner energy. Click. The sound lingered, fading into the silence. The flies stopped their buzzing. The cat ceased its rumbling. Everything was still, waiting, and the button continued to rise. The hum started low, a tremor in the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't mechanical, not precisely. It was resonant, like a colossal tuning fork vibrating within the metal bones of the observatory. The button hung suspended, a silent mockery of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Petrol sheen dripped from it, pooling on the workbench like viscous tears. Faux click. The echo of the final button placement lingered, a phantom vibration against my teeth. The disorientation intensified. A pressure behind my eyes, not the dull ache of fatigue, but a crushing weight. I tried to speak, to curse, to scream, to simply acknowledge the absurdity of the scene. Nothing. My throat constricted, a dry, useless passage. It wasn't a physical blockage. It was a silencing, a deliberate suppression. I felt a surge of bitter amusement. She would have found it ironic. The podcaster, rendered mute. The chronicler of the strange, unable to chronicle his own descent. The observatory shifted. Not a violent tremor, but a subtle warping of perspective. The domes, usually perfect spheres reflecting the star-dusted abyss, now bulged and contorted. The water within them rippled with impossible currents, forming shapes that defied geometry. A spiral that tightened into a vortex. A wave that froze mid-crest. The petrol light refracted through the distorted water, painting the chamber in a nauseating kaleidoscope of shadow-black and iridescent green. I reached for the workbench, bracing myself against the unsettling instability. My fingers scraped against the cold metal, the texture rough against my skin. A memory surfaced unbidden, her hand smooth and warm, resting on mine as we navigated a crowded marketplace. The scent of cinnamon and dust, a fleeting moment of normalcy now tainted by the suffocating silence. Sentimentality. A weakness. The hum intensified, coalescing into a discernible presence. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a vibration that resonated within my skull, a language spoken not through the ears but directly to the mind. The architect observes. The phrase, once a fragmented echo, now resonated with chilling clarity. It wasn't a voice. It was a knowing, a certainty, a judgment. I saw them then, reflections, not in the polished surfaces of the machinery, but in the distorted water of the domes. Multiple versions of myself, fractured and fragmented, each one subtly different. One with eyes too wide, another with a twisted smile, a third with a hand perpetually raised in a gesture of silent pleading. They didn't mimic my movements. They existed independently, observing me with an unsettling detachment. The orange tabby watched, its eyes glowing with an unnatural luminescence, reflecting the distorted images in the water. However, a low rumble, a confirmation. A wave of despair washed over me, colder and more profound than any I had ever known. It wasn't the fear of the unknown. It was the realization of my utter helplessness. The crushing weight of loneliness. I was a prisoner in this silent mausoleum, a pawn in a game orchestrated by something beyond comprehension. The flies, long since abandoning their erratic circling, now clung to the walls, their wings a silent tapestry of black. I tried to focus on a single point, a single detail to anchor myself to reality. The inscription on the workbench, the forgotten language. I strained to decipher the symbols, to find some clue, some explanation for this madness. But the words swam before my eyes, shifting and rearranging themselves into meaningless patterns. The architect awaits. The phrase pulsed with a malevolent energy, a silent command. My hand trembled as I reached out, not towards the buttons, but towards the nearest dome. The distorted water rippled, reflecting my image. But the reflection, it wasn't me. The face was similar, but the eyes were different. Cold, calculating. Empty. The reflection didn't blink, it didn't breathe, it simply stared. And as I stared back, I realized with a sickening certainty that the reflection was not an image. It was a replacement. The chamber. It was less a room or a nexus. The warped domes, those obscene parodies of spheres, converged here, their distorted reflections blurring into a single, shimmering plane. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, something acrid, like burnt sugar and despair. The petrol light pulsed, a sickly green heartbeat illuminating the space. Thrum, thrum. The rhythm was insidious, seeping into my bones, a counterpoint to the frantic hammering of my own pulse. I moved, compelled by a force I couldn't name. My legs felt leaden, each step a monumental effort. The floor wasn't solid, but yielded beneath my boots with a disconcerting sponginess. A residue, something clinging to the metal, damp and slick. I didn't look down. Didn't want to know. The orange tabby watched, a silent sentinel, its eyes twin embers in the gloom. A low vibration, a mechanical purr that grated on my nerves. It seemed to anticipate my movements, always a step ahead, a mocking echo of my own trajectory. The buttons. They weren't on the workbench anymore. They floated. A constellation of forgotten gods, suspended in the oppressive air. Each one pulsed with a sickly internal light, synchronized with the rhythm of the petrol sheen. Thrum, thrum. The light intensified, casting elongated, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. They weren't shadows, not precisely. They were projections. Fragments of memory twisted and fragmented. A laughing face, a hand reaching out. A whispered promise. All rendered in the nauseating green of the petrol light. Resistance felt futile, like trying to hold back a tide with a handful of sand. I wanted to scream, to rail against this absurdity, but the silencing remained, a vice around my throat, a lock on my voice. I felt a surge of bitter amusement. She would have found it tragically ironic. The podcaster, rendered mute, unable to record his own demise sentimentality. A weakness. I forced myself to focus on the geometry of the space, on the angles and the curves, anything to distract from the encroaching darkness. The entity wasn't a form, not in the traditional sense. It was a pattern. A shifting kaleidoscope of light and shadow, coalescing and dissolving in the space between the domes. It wasn't twenderlei, and then not there. It was always present, a subtle distortion of reality, a ripple in the fabric of existence. The buttons orbited it, their light intensifying, their silent hum resonating within my skull and thrummen, thrum. The rhythm was becoming unbearable, a physical pressure against my temples. I tried to turn away to retreat, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. A paralysis not physical, but mental. A surrender. I saw my reflection in the distorted water of the domes. But the reflection wasn't me. It was softer, gentler. The eyes held a trace of sadness, a flicker of regret. It was the face I'd worn before the cynicism, before the bitterness, before the loss. The entity pulsed, and the reflections multiplied. Dozens of faces, all subtly different, all bearing the same expression of quiet sorrow. They weren't mocking me. They weren't threatening me. They were understanding me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an external force. It wasn't some eldritch being manipulating my fate. It was me. Or rather, a fractured echo of who I once was, resurrected and distorted by grief and regret. The orange tabby tilted its head, its eyes glowing with an unnatural luminescence. A low, knowing rumble. It wasn't a sound of triumph. It was a sound of recognition, a shared understanding. The petrol light pulsed, bathing the chamber in an iridescent green glow. Thrum. The rhythm slowed, becoming more deliberate, more measured. It wasn't a heartbeat, it was a sigh, a release. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't an invasion. It was a homecoming. The charcoal scraped against the damp paper, a frantic rasp against the silence. Another sketch, another failure. The lines blurred, mimicking the distortions that plagued my vision. It wasn't an accurate representation. Nothing ever was anymore. The entity, it defied capture. It wasn't a shape, not truly. More like a pressure, a distortion of light that shifted and reformed with every blink. My hand trembled, leaving smudges across the page, a testament to my unraveling. Shh. A faint exhalation, barely audible, yet it seemed to vibrate within the marrow of my bones, breathing. Someone twined something twine was breathing. The walls, they weren't solid anymore. Not in the way they had been. The metal groaned, a low, mournful sigh that resonated with the shuth of the unseen breath. Cracks spiderwebbed across the domes, revealing glimpses of something else, a churning darkness, deeper than any abyss. The petrol light pulsed, a sickly green beacon in the encroaching gloom, casting elongated shadows that writhed and twisted like tormented spirits. I tried to focus on the geometry, the angles, the curves, but the structure itself was liquefying. The sponginess beneath my boots intensified, the residue clinging to my skin with a clammy persistence. Another vision, her face smiling. Mocking, the laughter echoed in my mind, a cruel parody of joy. It wasn't a memory, not exactly. It was a corruption, a perversion of something real. The details were wrong. The eyes too bright, the smile too wide. It was like looking at a photograph that had been submerged in acid, the image distorted and grotesque. Shh. The breathing grew closer, more insistent. A pressure against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. I fumbled for the diary, the pages slick with sweat. Scrawled words, a desperate attempt to document the descent. "It is inside me," I wrote, the pen shaking violently. A lie, or was it? The entity wasn't external. It was a reflection, a manifestation of my own fractured psyche. The orange tabby sat motionless, its eyes twin embers burning into my soul. A low rumble, a sound devoid of warmth, devoid of comfort. It wasn't a purr, it was a pronouncement, a judgment. The contortion intensified, the metal groaned and buckled, twisting into impossible shapes. A section of the dome peeled away, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. The air grew colder, heavier, saturated with the scent of decay. I saw them then. Others' faces. Hundreds of them pressed against the vortex, their features distorted and elongated. their eyes wide with a silent, unending terror. They were reaching out, their hands clawing at the air, desperate to escape. They were me. Fragments of myself, lost and forgotten, trapped within this nightmare. The visions escalated, the picnic, the argument, the silence that followed, the rain, all rendered in the nauseating green of the petrol light, each memory twisted and distorted, a cruel reminder of what I had lost. Shh. Shh. The breathing was directly behind me now, hot and fetid against my neck. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to fight back, but the silencing remained. A vice around my throat, a lock on my voice. I opened my mouth, desperately trying to form a word, any word, a plea, a curse, a confession, but nothing emerged, only the silent, suffocating pressure of the entity's breath. My tongue felt thick, heavy, unresponsive. I tried again, and again. The frustration mounted, a bitter tide of despair washing over me. I was trapped, imprisoned within my own mind, unable to communicate, unable to escape. The cat shifted, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. A sound that resonated deep within my bones, a vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the observatory. It was a signal, an acknowledgement, a confirmation. I was broken. Utterly and irrevocably broken. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. The darkness pressed in, a suffocating blanket of despair. I tried to speak one last time, to utter a single, defiant word. But only silence remained. The charcoal bled across the page, a smear of gray against the sickly green luminescence. Another failure, the entity. It wasn't a form to be captured, only a void to be measured. I tried to arrange the buttons, the cold, smooth surfaces pressing against my trembling fingers. Each one a mockery, a forgotten god rendered in miniature, arranged in a pattern that felt wrong, not chaotic, exactly, calculated. As if the entity itself were dictating the placement, a silent, cruel architect, the iron gates. Gera. A groan that resonated through the metal bones of the observatory, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the mechanism itself, but from the very air. They began to move, slow and deliberate, the joints protesting with a drawn-out screech that vibrated in my teeth. I didn't resist. What was the point? Resistance was just another sketch, another failed attempt to define the indefinable. It was a surrender, not a defeat. A recognition of my place. The sponginess beneath my boots deepened, the oily residue clinging to my skin like a second, suffocating layer. The petrolite pulsed, a sickly heartbeat in the encroaching darkness. I saw her face again, superimposed over the sketch, a cruel overlay of memory and corruption. The laughter, a fractured echo in the silence, felt less like a taunt now, more like an invitation. She wasn't mocking me, she was welcoming me. The faces in the vortex, they were clearer now, not just fragments of myself, but echoes of lives lived and lost. Each one a silent scream, a testament to the entity's endless appetite. They weren't trapped, they were archived, preserved in a state of perpetual suffering, a library of despair. I felt a kinship with them, a sense of belonging that chilled me to the core. My own memories, the picnic, the argument, the rain, they weren't mine anymore. They were data points, entries in a vast, unknowable catalogue. The cat remained motionless, perched atop the machinery, a black silhouette against the swirling darkness. Hurrah, a low rumble devoid of warmth, devoid of comfort. It wasn't a purr, it was a confirmation, a silent blessing. The entity wasn't hunting me. It was collecting me, adding me to its archive. I thought of the pod, the recordings, the desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable. All of it a futile gesture, a performance for an audience that didn't exist. A strange sense of peace settled over me, a quiet resignation that was more unsettling than any terror. The frantic energy that had driven me for so long dissipated, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. I felt lighter, released. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore, it was comforting. A blanket of oblivion. The entity's breath, once a suffocating weight, now felt like a gentle caress. I closed my eyes, expecting the darkness to consume me, to shatter my sanity. But it didn't. It was familiar, like returning to a place I had always known, a place I had always belonged. The orange tabby shifted, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. Futi devoned. Furta. The sound resonated deep within my bones, a vibration that seemed to unlock something within me. A memory, a truth, The silence deepened, and a single distorted phrase echoed in my mind. Not as a sound, but as a feeling. A certainty. It wasn't spoken, it was civi known. It bypassed my ears, resonated directly within my skull, a cold, insidious whisper. Welcome home. The tabby remained, a black punctuation mark against the petrol luminescence. Its ears, torn and ragged, twitched with an unsettling precision, as if attuned to frequencies I couldn't perceive. The air thickened, a viscous weight pressing against my skin. The entity's presence wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a density. A tangible shift in the atmosphere, like the build-up before a storm, except the storm was silent. The flies returned. Not a scattered swarm this time, but a focused congregation. A black vortex tightening around a single point in the space before me. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was engineered. A demonstration. They pulsed, a living, iridescent mass, reflecting the petrol light in 1,000 tiny fractured shards. I wanted to look away to shield myself from the spectacle, but my gaze was locked, a prisoner of morbid curiosity. The memory of her face, the cruel curve of her lips, flashed again, superimposed over the swirling flies. A mocking echo of a smile. Then, just as abruptly as they appeared, they vanished, dissipated into nothingness, leaving behind only the oily residue clinging to the damp concrete. A syncade. A single drop of condensation falling from the unseen ceiling broke the absolute silence. It seemed impossibly loud, a hammer blow against the fragile membrane of my sanity. I didn't flinch. What was the point of flinching? It wouldn't change anything, it would only betray a weakness I could no longer afford. The machinery hummed, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. I couldn't tell if it was the equipment itself, or some internal resonance within my own skull. The silence had become a weapon, a tool to strip away any remaining semblance of self. I tried to focus on my breathing to anchor myself to the present, but even that felt artificial. Like a performance, I was playing the role of a man observing a phenomenon, when in reality I was becoming the phenomenon. I saw the buttons again, reflected in the polished surface of the machinery. The miniature gods, their faces contorted in expressions of silent agony. Each one a tiny monument to a forgotten power, a power that was now mine. The feeling wasn't triumphant. It was inevitable, like a seed germinating in fertile ground. The pod recordings, the frantic scribbles, the desperate pleas for help, all of it, a pathetic attempt to resist the inevitable, a child's drawing of a monster. Crack, a sharp, brittle sound. The glass of the observation dome, weakened by the encroaching decay, had finally succumbed. The silence remained unbroken, the absence of sound somehow more profound than any noise could ever be. A clean break, a severing. My hand moved, not of my volition, but as if guided by an unseen force. It reached out towards the machinery, towards the buttons, towards the entity itself. My fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of a single button, the one depicting the god whose face was obscured by shadow. The iridescent petrol light caught the surface, creating a swirling vortex of color. It felt warm, comforting. The distorted phrase echoed again, not as a sound, but as a feeling, a certainty. Welcome home. It bypassed my ears, resonated directly within my skull. A cold, insidious whisper. It wasn't a threat. It was an acknowledgement. A confirmation. The memory of the picnic, the argument, the rain. They were fading, dissolving into the encroaching silence. They were being replaced by something else, something new. The orange tabby shifted, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. The sound resonated deep within my bones, a vibration that seemed to unlock something within me, a memory, a truth, a name. Kensington. Frederick Kensington. But that wasn't quite right anymore. Shh. The final, shattering sound. Not loud, not violent. A delicate fracturing like ice on a still pond. The glass of the dome, the last barrier between me and something. The light intensified, bathing the room in an iridescent glow. I closed my eyes, expecting oblivion, expecting release. The screen faded to black, leaving only the faint echo of a distorted whisper.